Welcome back to Midnight Affair Tales. Thank you for joining us. Jake Henderson never imagined that the worst day of his life would begin with the smell of fresh coffee. It was just another Tuesday morning in Austin, Texas, and he was getting ready for work. The sun peeked through the blinds and his wife, Melissa, hummed a soft tune in the kitchen. Everything seemed normal. But normal was a lie. A single notification changed everything. His best friend, Mark, had sent a text by accident. "Last night was incredible. Can't wait to see you again, babe." Jake's heart stopped. His hands trembled as he stared at the screen, willing the words to change. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe it was for someone else. But then another text followed. "Can't talk much. Jake's here. I'll see you after he leaves." A sharp pain stabbed his chest. Melissa's voice drifted from the kitchen, light and carefree. How long had this been going on? How many times had she smiled at him, kissed him, while sneaking around with his best friend? His mind raced. He could confront her now, flip the table, demand answers, but what good would that do? She had already chosen her side. His own wife. His childhood friend. And he knew deep down that this wasn't just about them. His parents adored Melissa. They always took her side, dismissed his concerns, treated him like the villain when he voiced his doubts. If they found out, would they even support him? Or would they tell him to just forgive her? Jake clenched his jaw. His world was falling apart and he had no one to catch him. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to be the fool in this story. The question was, what was he going to do next? Jake didn't confront Melissa right away. Instead, he played along, pretending nothing had changed. He needed time to think, to plan. But the rage boiled inside him like an untamed fire. That evening he visited his parents, hoping, praying, that they would be on his side. But their reaction was worse than he expected. "Melissa made a mistake, Jake," his mother sighed. "You can't just throw away your marriage over one bad decision." His father nodded. "Think about your future. About family. You can work through this." Jake stared at them, disbelief tightening around his throat. He had expected shock, anger, maybe even advice on how to move forward, but not this. Not just let it go. Melissa wasn't even sorry. That much was clear. She hadn't come clean, hadn't confessed, hadn't begged for forgiveness. If anything, she probably assumed she'd never get caught. And now, even when he had proof, his own parents were shielding her. Something inside him snapped. He wasn't going to be the pitiful husband who stuck around, pretending everything was fine. He wasn't going to be the man who forgave the unforgivable. No, he was going to make sure they all regretted ever betraying him. And for that, he had to disappear. Jake was meticulous. He wasn't about to make a scene or let emotions dictate his actions. He had seen enough stories where men let anger get the best of them, where they fought, screamed, or begged. No, not him. He was smarter than that. Over the next few days he set everything in motion. He withdrew his savings, transferred assets to a separate account, and quietly began liquidating his investments. He cut unnecessary ties, deleted old accounts, and made sure nothing could trace him. Every move was calculated, precise, designed to leave no trace behind. Melissa remained blissfully unaware. She continued her routine, still sneaking around with Mark, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. His parents called him over for dinner, pretending everything was normal, but Jake barely spoke. He was already mentally gone. Every bite of food tasted bland, every conversation felt like a lie. The night before he left, he sat in his office and finalized the paperwork for his divorce. He scheduled it to be filed the moment he vanished. He double-checked his bank transfers and packed his belongings with the precision of a man going to war. There was no room for mistakes. As he looked around the house one last time, memories flooded his mind. Laughter, holidays, quiet nights by the fire, all of it tainted now. A bitter thought crossed his mind. Would they even care that he was gone? Jake left before dawn. He had packed his essentials the night before, keeping only what he truly needed. His phone was the first thing he got rid of, tossing it into a river on his way out of town. No social media, no goodbye messages, just silence. By the time the sun fully rose, he was already hundreds of miles away. He kept his car filled with gas, avoiding major highways, staying off the grid. He used only cash, changed his appearance slightly, and kept his head low. He was no longer Jake Henderson, the betrayed husband. He was someone else now. Someone free. As for Melissa and his parents? They'd wake up soon, confused at first. Then panic would set in. Calls to his phone would go straight to voicemail. His house would be empty. The divorce papers would arrive like a gut punch. That thought? That was the first time in weeks that Jake smiled. Montana. He never thought he'd end up here, but it felt right. The cold, the distance, the solitude, it was exactly what he needed. He rented a small cabin, paid in cash, and started fresh. For the first time in years, he woke up without a weight on his chest. No lies. No betrayal. Just the quiet hum of the wind against the trees. He found simple work in town, kept to himself, and slowly began rebuilding his life. But he wasn't done yet. He knew Melissa and his parents would come looking for him, desperate for answers, scrambling to understand why he had left so suddenly. That was part of the plan. Let them wonder. Let them suffer in the uncertainty. Because when the time came when they least expected it, he would return. And his revenge? It was going to be calculated, merciless, and unforgettable. Are you ready to see how far betrayal can push a man? Jake sat on the porch of his small Montana cabin, staring at the horizon as the last traces of sunlight dipped below the trees. The silence here was deafening compared to the chaos he had left behind. No arguments, no fake apologies, no betrayal. Just him in the open wilderness. But solitude didn't erase memories. They crept in like uninvited guests. The laughter of his wife, the pride in his parents' eyes whenever they spoke about her, the countless sacrifices he had made for people who never truly valued him. He had built his life around the illusion that love was unbreakable. And yet, the very people who were supposed to love him the most had betrayed him without hesitation. He thought about who he used to be, Jake Henderson, the man who always put family first, who worked long hours to provide Melissa with a comfortable life, who never doubted his parents' intentions. That version of himself was dead. The man sitting in this chair, staring at the wilderness, was someone new. Someone with a plan. He had spent weeks adjusting to his new reality. He picked up work at a local mechanic shop, paying everything in cash, staying under the radar. He had even changed his name, using a fake ID he had acquired before leaving Austin. He wasn't taking any chances. He wasn't just hiding, he was preparing. But preparation meant more than just disappearing. If he was going to return and settle the score, he needed more than just anger. He needed power. And to get that, he had to start over completely. Jake wasn't the kind of man to stay broken for long. If he was going to come back, it wouldn't be as the same person Melissa and his parents had walked all over. He needed leverage. He needed financial power, influence, and an entirely new identity that couldn't be traced. But nothing came easy. At first he struggled. His early investments were shaky. He lost thousands in a bad stock trade, falling for what he thought was an insider tip. The crypto market was unpredictable, and he got burned trusting the wrong exchange. Frustration mounted. He wasn't invincible, and that realization forced him to slow down, study, and become smarter than the game itself. He learned patience. He tracked patterns. He observed instead of rushing in. Soon he wasn't just making random trades, he was predicting the market's movements before they happened. Within months, what started as small, cautious investments began to snowball. He diversified, learning everything he could about offshore banking, real estate, and private investments. His money grew faster than he ever imagined. Within a year, he had accumulated a small fortune, one that he kept hidden from any government records. But financial success wasn't enough. He needed connections. He started networking in exclusive business circles, attending closed-door meetings where only the ruthless thrived. He befriended influential people, played the role of a reclusive but highly skilled investor. Some assumed he was an ex-criminal lying low, while others thought he was a runaway genius who had walked away from the corporate world. He let them believe whatever they wanted. It kept him unpredictable, untouchable. Then came the moment that truly changed everything. Jake was approached by Derek Cole, a name he remembered from Austin but had never met in person. Derek was dangerous, a man with deep ties in underground dealings, but more importantly, he was a man with power. He had heard whispers of Jake's success and wanted him in on a deal. "This isn't the kind of opportunity that knocks twice," Derek had said over whiskey in a high-rise penthouse. "You help me, I help you. And when you decide to settle your debts, you'll have the right backing to do it." Jake knew exactly what Derek meant. Revenge required power, and power required allies, even if they weren't the cleanest ones. He shook Derek's hand. The pieces were finally coming together. And when the time came to return to Austin, he wouldn't just be Jake Henderson, the betrayed husband. He would be a force they never saw coming. Jake had spent over a year reinventing himself, accumulating wealth and power in ways he never thought possible. But with success came the inevitable challenge: could he truly remain invisible forever? Could he keep his past buried when the people he left behind were still searching for answers? One evening, as he checked into a high-end business club in Billings, Montana, a familiar face nearly shattered his illusion of anonymity. It was an old colleague from his days in Austin, someone he had once shared drinks and conversations with at company events. The man squinted at Jake as if trying to place him, but Jake kept his composure, quickly adjusting his posture and demeanor. "Do I know you from somewhere?" the man asked. Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "I don't think so. I've been in Montana for years." The man hesitated but eventually shrugged. "You just look like someone I used to know." Jake smiled politely and walked away, but his heart pounded. He knew it was only a matter of time before someone recognized him. He had to act soon before his cover slipped. Back in Austin, Melissa was unraveling. Jake's sudden disappearance had thrown her into a spiral of confusion and desperation. She had expected anger, tears, perhaps even a dramatic confrontation, but not silence. Not complete erasure. Mark, her secret lover, had grown distant, uncomfortable with the chaos surrounding Jake's disappearance. He wanted out, sensing that things were becoming too complicated. Melissa, once confident and in control, was now a shadow of herself. Jake's parents weren't much better. They had tried to reach out to him, leaving countless messages that never got a response. They visited his old workplace, spoke to his former friends, even hired a private investigator. But Jake had covered his tracks too well. He was nowhere to be found. Then one evening an envelope arrived at Melissa's doorstep. No sender, no return address, just her name written in sharp, bold letters. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with only 3 words. "You'll see soon." Her heart pounded. Was it Jake? Was he watching? For the first time since his disappearance, Melissa felt something she had never felt before: fear. Melissa sat in her dimly lit living room, clutching the cryptic note in her trembling hands. She read the words over and over again: "You'll see soon." It had been months since Jake vanished, and she had almost convinced herself that he was gone for good. But this was something else. A warning? A threat? Or worse, proof that he was still out there watching. She tried to convince herself it wasn't him. Maybe it was Mark playing mind games or some cruel prank from a stranger. But deep down she knew. Jake had always been methodical, patient. He never acted on impulse. And if he had sent this, it meant he had a plan. Melissa grabbed her phone and dialed Mark's number. He didn't pick up. She tried again. Straight to voicemail. Frustration boiled inside her. Mark had been distant lately, pulling away, talking less, avoiding their usual meetings. She needed him now more than ever, but she was starting to realize that, just like Jake, Mark was slipping away too. That night she barely slept. Every sound made her jump, every shadow seemed to move. The confidence she once had, the control she had wielded over her life, it was slipping through her fingers. Mark sat alone in his apartment, staring at his phone screen. 10 missed calls from Melissa. He knew what she wanted: to talk about the note, to demand answers, to make him reassure her that everything was fine. But he couldn't, because he wasn't sure of anything anymore. Jake's disappearance had always felt off. It wasn't like him to just walk away. And now, with this note showing up, Mark felt like a hunted man. He tried to tell himself it was a coincidence, that Jake was long gone. But a part of him, the part that still remembered the way Jake looked at him the last time they spoke, knew better. Mark reached for his drink, but his hands were shaking. He had never thought twice about his affair with Melissa back then. It had been easy, thrilling, something they thought they could get away with. But now, for the first time, he wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. His stomach twisted into knots. No one ever came to his apartment unannounced. He hesitated before slowly walking toward the door. The knock came again. Harder this time. Mark swallowed, his pulse hammering in his ears. Was it Jake? Was this the moment he finally paid the price? He reached for the doorknob with a shaky hand and slowly turned it. Mark hesitated, his fingers hovering over the doorknob. His heart pounded so loudly he could hear it in his ears. Whoever was on the other side of the door wasn't going away. Another knock, this time harder, more deliberate. He swallowed hard, his mouth dry. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but where? There was nowhere to go. He had spent months looking over his shoulder, drowning in paranoia, but now it felt real. He took a deep breath, bracing himself, and slowly turned the knob. The door creaked open just enough for him to peek through. A shadow stood against the dimly lit hallway. His breath hitched. "Who's there?" he forced out, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure took a step forward into the light. Relief flooded Mark's body for a split second before fear crept back in. It wasn't Jake. It was someone else, someone worse. "Long time no see, Mark." The voice was cold, emotionless. Mark's blood ran cold. He recognized the man instantly. Derek Cole. A name he hadn't heard in years, but one that had haunted him in ways he never acknowledged. A loan shark. A dangerous man from their past, one Mark and Jake had both crossed before. But why was he here? And why now? I don't have anything to do with," Mark stammered, stepping back. Derek pushed the door open wider, stepping inside without invitation. His presence alone filled the small apartment with suffocating tension. "Oh, but you do," Derek said smoothly, scanning the room with a smirk. "You see, Jake owed me. And when a man like Jake disappears, well, someone's gotta pay." Mark felt his stomach drop. Jake owed him? This was news to him. But judging by the glint in Derek's eyes, this wasn't just about money. This was personal. Melissa's hands shook as she scrolled through her messages. Still no word from Mark. The silence was making her uneasy. She wasn't used to being the one left in the dark. First Jake disappeared, now Mark was ghosting her. Something was wrong and she knew it. Her gut told her it all circled back to Jake. That note, the looming threat, it was all connected. A part of her still refused to believe Jake was capable of something so calculated, so sinister. The man she had married had been predictable, safe. But the Jake who had disappeared? He was a mystery. And if there was one thing she hated, it was not being in control. She poured herself a glass of wine, forcing herself to think logically. If Jake was back, why hadn't he confronted her directly? He had always been one for direct confrontation. He didn't play games. Unless... Her phone buzzed. A private number. Her pulse quickened. She hesitated before answering. "Hello," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Silence. Then a slow, deliberate exhale. "You didn't think I'd forget, did you?" The voice sent chills down her spine. Melissa's grip tightened on the glass. "Jake." A low chuckle came through the line. "That's right. Did you miss me?" She couldn't respond. Her throat went dry, her mind raced. "You see, Melissa," Jake continued, his voice calm, almost playful. "You thought I'd just fade away. That I'd let you and Mark get away with it. That my own parents would protect you. But you were wrong." She swallowed hard, trying to keep her composure. "What do you want?" "Oh, you'll see soon," he said, echoing the words from the note. "But let's just say, I'm done being the one left behind." The line went dead. Melissa stood frozen, the weight of his words settling over her like a heavy blanket. Jake wasn't just back. He was planning something. And for the first time she realized she might not be able to stop him. Mark's mouth went dry as Derek stepped further into the apartment, his eyes scanning every inch of the room. It wasn't just about the money, that much Mark could tell. Derek's presence carried something more ominous, a promise of retribution. "I don't understand," Mark muttered, forcing himself to stand tall despite the sweat gathering at the base of his neck. "What does Jake have to do with you?" Derek smirked, taking his time as he moved toward the small table in the center of the room, running his fingers over the surface as if he owned the place. "Oh, Mark," Derek said, his voice mockingly sweet. "Jake didn't tell you everything, did he? You see, when a man like Jake disappears, it causes ripples. And in my world, when a debt goes unpaid, it doesn't just vanish." Mark's heart pounded. He didn't know much about Jake's life outside of their shared betrayals, but he never imagined he was involved with someone like Derek. "I don't have anything to do with this," Mark said, his voice cracking slightly. "If Jake owes you money, that's on him." "I had no idea." Derek laughed, shaking his head. "Oh, you poor bastard. You think I'm here for money?" Mark's stomach twisted. If it wasn't money, then what? Revenge? A message? Derek reached into his jacket, pulling out a folded slip of paper. He tossed it onto the table, nodding for Mark to pick it up. With shaky fingers, Mark unfolded the note. "I always settle my debts. See you soon." Jake's handwriting. The blood drained from Mark's face. Derek leaned in close, his breath hot against Mark's ear. You and Melissa thought you could destroy a man like Jake and just walk away? His voice dropped into a whisper. He's coming. And when he does, he won't just be looking for you. Melissa sat curled up on her couch, staring at the blank TV screen, her mind racing. The weight of Jake's words still lingered in the air, suffocating her. He had never spoken to her like that before, never with such calculated control. A year ago she could have scoffed at the idea of Jake being a threat. He was predictable, level-headed, even naive. But this Jake? The man who sent an ominous message, who vanished without a trace, who had let her stew in uncertainty for months. This was someone she didn't recognize. Her phone buzzed again. Another private number. Her breath hitched. She hesitated, but she had no choice. Hello? Her voice was barely above a whisper. This time the silence stretched longer. Then the sound of a slow inhale. You're scared, aren't you? Jake's voice was steady, almost amused. Melissa's grip on the phone tightened. If you think you can scare me into something? Jake chuckled. Oh, Melissa. This isn't about scaring you. This is about making sure you understand. Understand what? She snapped, trying to sound in control. That you never had control to begin with? A chill ran down her spine. You see, Melissa, Jake continued, his voice like a whisper in the dark, for a long time, I let you decide how this story would go. I let you and Mark take what you wanted from me, let my own parents turn their backs on me. But now? His voice hardened. Now I'm writing the ending. Melissa forced herself to breathe. What do you want? Jake didn't answer right away. Then finally, in a voice so calm it made her skin crawl, he said, You'll see soon. The line went dead. Melissa stared at the phone, her fingers numb. She had thought Jake's disappearance was his way of running. Now she understood the truth. Jake hadn't run away. He had been planning. And whatever he had in store, she wasn't sure she could stop it. Mark sat on the edge of his bed, gripping the note Derek had given him. His mind was racing, the weight of Jake's looming return pressing on his chest like a vice. He had always known Jake wasn't weak, but this was different. This was methodical, calculated, and worst of all, merciless. Mark wasn't sleeping anymore. His drinking had worsened, his hands shaking each morning until he had his first glass of whiskey. He barely showed up to work, and when he did, his boss gave him looks that made it clear his days were numbered. It was all slipping through his fingers, and no matter how hard he tried to convince himself otherwise, he knew the truth. Jake was coming for him. Melissa wasn't doing much better. She still looked composed on the outside, but Mark could see the cracks forming. He saw the way her fingers trembled when she picked up a glass, how she jumped every time her phone buzzed. She was trying to hold everything together, but for the first time she was losing control. Desperate, she tried reaching out to Robert Henderson, hoping Jake's father could help. She played the victim, pretending she was worried for Jake, begging Robert to tell her if he had heard from him. But Robert saw right through her. He had once adored Melissa, treated her like family, but now there was nothing but cold indifference in his eyes. You don't get to play the concerned wife now, Melissa, Robert had said, his voice sharp. You made your choices. Now you live with them. That moment shattered something inside her. For the first time she realized she had no control left. That was when she called Mark. That was when she finally admitted the truth to herself. We need a plan, she said, her voice tight. We can't just sit here and wait for him to come for us. Mark let out a dry laugh, rubbing his temples. And what do you suggest? Melissa hesitated. She didn't have an answer. She had always been able to manipulate people, twist situations in her favor, but Jake wasn't playing by the old rules anymore. Mark leaned forward, his voice raw. We don't have many options, Melissa. We need someone who can stop him before it's too late. Melissa swallowed hard. Who? Mark exhaled slowly, locking eyes with her. We bring in someone who can. Melissa's blood ran cold. She knew exactly what he meant. While Melissa and Mark scrambled, someone else had begun to feel the weight of Jake's absence. His father, Robert Henderson. Robert sat alone in his study, the dim glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows over old family pictures. He reached for a framed photo of a younger Jake, standing proudly in his college graduation gown. His son had been strong, determined, but Robert had never truly appreciated him. Not when it mattered. His wife Linda had always favored Melissa, brushing off Jake's concerns, urging him to forgive her even when the betrayal became too obvious. Robert had gone along with it, choosing peace over justice. He had thought he was doing the right thing, keeping the family together. But now, with Jake gone and a storm brewing, he felt the sting of his failure. He should have stood up for his son. He should have seen Melissa for what she was. But he hadn't. And now he might never get the chance to fix it. A knock at the door startled him. He placed the photo back on the desk and stood up. When he opened the door, his heart nearly stopped. There, standing in the dim porch light, was Derek. "We need to talk," Derek said, stepping forward. "About your son?" Robert swallowed hard. Jake's absence had left a void, and now it was being filled with something far more dangerous. He stepped aside, allowing Derek into the house. The air inside felt heavy, as if a storm was about to break. Robert led him into the study, pouring himself a glass of whiskey before sitting down. He needed it. "What do you want?" Robert finally asked. Derek leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "It's not about what I want. It's about what's coming." Robert tightened his grip on his glass. "Jake?" Derek nodded. "He's not the same man who left, Robert. And if you think you can stop him, you're wrong." Robert exhaled, feeling the weight of his past mistakes crushing him. "I don't want to stop him," he admitted. "I just want to see my son again." Derek studied him for a long moment before smirking. "Then you better brace yourself. Because when he comes back, you might not recognize him." Robert looked away, his heart heavy. He had failed Jake before. He wouldn't fail him again. Melissa sat in the dimly lit living room, gripping her glass of wine so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of her once perfect life, now reduced to chaos. Jake wasn't just back. He was orchestrating something far bigger than she had anticipated. She had spent years manipulating people, bending them to her will, controlling the narrative. But now she felt hunted, cornered like an animal with no escape. The memory of his voice still echoed in her ears. "You never had control to begin with." His words weren't just a warning, they were a death sentence. Jake wasn't merely out for answers, he was out for destruction. A knock at the door sent her pulse skyrocketing. She stood up too quickly, nearly knocking over the glass in her hand. With cautious steps, she made her way to the door and hesitated before pulling it open. Mark stood there, looking just as haunted as she felt. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and his face pale. "You look like hell," she muttered. He pushed past her without a word and dropped into the chair, rubbing his temples. "It's happening, Melissa. It's all happening." She didn't need to ask what he meant. She already knew. "We need a plan," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "We can't just sit here and wait for him to come for us." Melissa nodded, sitting across from him. "And what do you suggest?" Mark's jaw tightened. "We find him first?" Melissa scoffed. "You really think that's possible? Jake has covered every track. He's been planning this for too long. If he wanted us dead, we wouldn't even see it coming." Mark ran a hand through his hair. "We don't need to kill him. We just need to stop him before he ruins us." Melissa leaned forward, narrowing her eyes. "How?" A long silence filled the room. Finally, Mark said, "We bring in someone who can." Melissa's blood ran cold. She knew exactly what he meant. Jake sat in a sleek, modern apartment overlooking the Montana skyline. He had changed everything about himself. His name, his identity, his habits. The man he had been in Austin was long gone. Now he was someone else. He had spent the last year carefully orchestrating his return, ensuring that every move he made sent ripples through the lives of those who had betrayed him. Mark and Melissa were panicking, exactly as he had intended. His parents were questioning their own actions, regretting their choices. And soon they would all feel the full weight of what he had become. His phone buzzed. He picked it up, reading the encrypted message on the screen. "It's done. They're making their move." Jake smirked. Everything was falling into place. He had expected Mark and Melissa to react this way. They weren't strategists, they were desperate. Desperate people made mistakes. And mistakes were exactly what he was counting on. He reached for his whiskey, swirling the amber liquid in his glass before taking a slow sip. His mind drifted back to the days when he had trusted Mark, when he had loved Melissa. It felt like a lifetime ago. Now there was only one thing left. The final act. He turned back to his laptop, pulling up a file with names, locations, and movements. He had accounted for everything, Every decision they would make, every person they would turn to. The difference between them and him? He wasn't reacting. He was controlling every piece of the game. And soon it would all come crashing down. Melissa paced the living room, her mind racing. The walls were closing in on her, and no matter how hard she tried to think of a way out, Jake had already anticipated her every move. Mark sat slumped in the chair, his face lined with stress. "We need someone who can stop him," Mark had said. And now that someone was here. The door creaked open and a man stepped inside. He was tall, dressed in black, with piercing green eyes that scanned the room with unsettling precision. He moved like a ghost, silent, calculated, dangerous. Melissa had heard of him before. Lucas Grayson. A man who lived in the shadows, handling problems that couldn't be solved legally. He wasn't just an enforcer, he was an assassin. The kind of man people whispered about but never dared to cross. Lucas sat down, folding his hands on the table. "I don't take contracts unless they interest me," he said, his voice cold. "Why should I care about your problem?" Melissa took a deep breath. "Because Jake won't stop. He's going to ruin us." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "Ruin you? Or give you exactly what you deserve?" Melissa's breath caught in her throat. The way he said it, it was as if he knew. As if he had already judged them. Mark shifted uncomfortably. "We'll pay you whatever you want," Mark said quickly. "Just find him. Make him disappear." Lucas leaned back, regarding them with amusement. "You're desperate," he mused. "That makes you predictable." He drummed his fingers on the table before finally nodding. "Fine. I'll take the job." Melissa exhaled sharply, but the relief was short-lived. Lucas smirked. "But don't think for a second this will go the way you planned." Jake sat in his apartment, watching the encrypted feed from his hidden cameras. Every corner of Melissa's house had been bugged, every phone call intercepted. He had known about their plan before they even spoke it out loud. And now he watched as they welcomed Lucas Grayson into their trap. A slow smile played on his lips. They thought they could outmaneuver him. They thought hiring an assassin would solve their problem. But they had made a fatal mistake. Lucas wasn't just anyone. He was a man Jake had been expecting. Jake had done his research. Lucas Grayson had a reputation for being untraceable, ruthless, and highly efficient. But what Mark and Melissa didn't know was that Lucas had his own reasons for taking this job. Reasons that had nothing to do with money. Jake picked up his phone and sent a single message. "It's time." A response came immediately. "Understood." Jake leaned back, swirling his whiskey as he watched Lucas studying Melissa and Mark, his expression unreadable. It wouldn't be long now. The pieces were moving exactly as he had planned. And soon the hunter would become the hunted. Lucas Grayson sat in his dimly lit motel room, a cigarette burning between his fingers as he scrolled through the dossier he had compiled on Jake Henderson. He had never met the man in person, but Jake's name had come up in certain circles. Circles where people like Lucas thrived. This wasn't just a revenge story. It was something deeper. He had agreed to take the contract, but not for the money. He had no loyalty to Melissa or Mark. If anything, their desperation disgusted him. People like them were parasites, feeding off others until there was nothing left. No, Lucas had taken the job because he was intrigued. Jake was no ordinary Mark. He had resources, intelligence, and, most importantly, patience. The kind of patience that only came with a long, calculated plan. Lucas knew the signs. This wasn't a man who would react emotionally. This was a man who had been waiting for his moment, and Lucas had a gut feeling that stepping into this game meant playing by Jake's rules. He exhaled slowly, watching the smoke swirl in the dim light. His phone buzzed. He picked it up and saw an unknown number. A single message appeared on the screen. "We should talk." Lucas smirked. He had been expecting this. Jake sat in his secluded hideout, phone in hand, waiting. He knew Lucas would answer. Men like him were predictable in their curiosity. The moment the call connected, Jake spoke first. "You're not here for them?" Pause. Then a low chuckle. "No, I'm not." Jake leaned back, satisfied. "Then why take the job?" Lucas sighed. "I wanted to see if you were as good as they say." Jake smirked. "And? You're better?" For a moment, silence stretched between them, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. Then Lucas continued. "I've looked into you, Jake. You're not just some tech guy who got cheated on. You're a ghost. You vanished without a trace, built something new. That takes skill." "I appreciate the compliment." Lucas exhaled. So, what happens now? You know I'm not really here to kill you. Jake's voice was calm, steady. That depends. What do you want? A long pause. Then Lucas said, a front row seat. Jake laughed. You'll get more than that. But if you want in, you play by my rules? Lucas considered this for a moment before responding. Fair enough. Just don't bore me. Jake hung up, his mind already working through the next step. He had just turned his greatest enemy into an ally. And now the real game could begin. Jake leaned back in his chair, staring at the glowing monitors in front of him. He had spent over a year preparing for this moment, and now the final pieces were falling into place. Lucas was no longer a threat. He was a wild card, but one that Jake had anticipated. Now all that remained was Mark and Melissa. They were desperate, and desperation made people reckless. He clicked through various camera feeds, watching as Melissa and Mark sat together in her living room, their anxiety palpable. He smirked. They had no idea how deep they were in. Melissa was clutching a glass of wine with trembling fingers, while Mark paced back and forth, running his hands through his hair. They're going to kill us if we don't do something, Mark muttered. Melissa's voice was sharp. We brought in Lucas. He'll handle it. Jake chuckled to himself. Well, if only they knew. Lucas wasn't handling anything except a front row seat to their downfall. He typed a message into an encrypted chat. A moment later, a response flashed on the screen. They're moving. Proceed as planned. Jake's smirk widened. They were walking straight into his trap. Mark sat in his car outside the dimly lit warehouse, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel. Every instinct in his body screamed that this was a bad idea, but he had no other options. Melissa was unraveling, Lucas was playing his own game, and Jake was out there watching. A knock on the window startled him. He turned to see Lucas standing there, expression unreadable. Mark unlocked the door, and the assassin slipped into the passenger seat. You ready? Lucas asked. Mark swallowed. As ready as I'll ever be. Lucas smirked. Good. Because after tonight, nothing will ever be the same. They stepped out of the car and walked toward the warehouse entrance. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of oil and metal. A single light bulb flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the concrete floor. And then from the darkness, a voice spoke. Took you long enough? Mark stiffened. Jake stepped into the light, calm, composed, completely in control. He looked nothing like the man they had betrayed. This wasn't the broken husband they had discarded. This was someone else entirely. I have to admit, Jake said, folding his arms. I expected better from you, Mark. But then again, I shouldn't be surprised. Mark's throat was dry. Jake, listen. No, Jake interrupted, his voice dangerously low. You listen? He took a step closer, his presence suffocating. You thought I disappeared. That I was weak. That I would let you get away with what you did. He let the words hang in the air. You were wrong. Lucas leaned against the wall, watching with mild amusement. He had no interest in interfering. This was Jake's game now. Melissa wasn't here. Jake had made sure of that. This moment was for Mark alone. Mark's voice wavered. What do you want? Jake smirked. I want you to suffer. Just like I did. And before Mark could react, the lights cut out. Mark's breath hitched as the warehouse was plunged into complete darkness. His pulse pounded in his ears, his instincts screaming at him to run, but he knew there was nowhere to go. Jake had orchestrated this moment perfectly. Jake, he called out, his voice unsteady. This isn't necessary. We can talk about this. A slow, deliberate footstep echoed through the warehouse, followed by another. Then silence. Jake's voice emerged from the shadows, calm and methodical. Talk? You mean the way you and Melissa talked behind my back? The way you planned everything while I was breaking my back to give her the life she wanted? Mark swallowed hard. We made mistakes. We weren't thinking straight. A quiet chuckle in the dark sent a shiver down Mark's spine. No, Mark. I wasn't thinking straight. I was naive. But that's over now. A metallic clank sounded from somewhere in the room. Mark spun around, his nerves on edge. He could feel his body shaking, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Jake, please? The warehouse flooded with red emergency lighting, casting eerie shadows against the metal beams. Mark squinted, adjusting to the dim glow. Then he saw him, Jake, standing just feet away, holding a small remote in his hand. You remember what it felt like, don't you? Jake mused, tilting his head. The guilt, the fear of getting caught. Except you never really suffered, did you? You never faced the consequences. Mark took a shaky step back. A loud crash cut him off. The heavy doors of the warehouse slammed shut behind him. Mark turned, realizing he was locked in. Jake continued. Tonight, Mark, you're going to understand what it feels like to lose everything. Melissa paced her living room, her mind spinning. Mark had been gone too long. She had tried calling him, texting him. Nothing. A sick feeling settled in her gut. Had something happened? Her phone vibrated and she lunged for it. A single message flashed on the screen. It's done. Her blood ran cold. She didn't recognize the number, but she didn't have to. She knew exactly who had sent it. Jake. Her hands trembled as she reread the message. What did he mean? What had he done? She swallowed hard and grabbed her purse, her car keys jingling in her grip. She needed to find out what had happened to Mark. She wasn't going to sit around and wait for the past to catch up with her. Driving through the dimly lit streets, her thoughts raced. She had underestimated Jake. She thought his threats were just that, threats. But the way he had been orchestrating everything, staying one step ahead, made her realize just how badly she had miscalculated. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. Come find him. 345 Westbury Warehouse. Her heart nearly stopped. She knew that place. It was an old, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. She pressed the gas pedal, the car roaring forward. She had no choice now. She was walking straight into the fire. And she had no idea if she'd make it out. Melissa's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The old warehouse loomed in the distance, its rusted exterior barely visible in the dim moonlight. She could feel the pulse of her own heartbeat, hammering against her chest as she pulled up outside the building. The silence was deafening. No sirens, no signs of life. Just the cold, oppressive stillness that sent a shiver down her spine. Stepping out of the car, she forced herself to take slow, deliberate breaths. She had no idea what waited inside, but she knew one thing: she wasn't leaving without answers. With shaky hands, she reached for the warehouse door, pushing it open. The air inside was thick with the scent of rust and oil, the dim red emergency lighting flickering ominously. She took a cautious step forward, her heels clicking against the concrete floor. "Mark," she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. A groan echoed from somewhere in the shadows. Her pulse skyrocketed as she moved toward the sound, her eyes darting around for any sign of movement. Then she saw him, Mark, bound to a chair in the center of the warehouse, his face bruised, a cut trickling blood down his temple. His head lolled forward, his breathing labored. "Mark!" She rushed forward, reaching for him, but before she could touch him, a voice cut through the darkness. "Not so fast, Melissa." She froze. Jake stepped into the light, his expression unreadable. He held a gun in one hand, his stance relaxed yet terrifyingly confident. Melissa's breath hitched. This wasn't the man she had once known. This was someone else entirely. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The air between them was charged with years of betrayal, hurt, and unresolved rage. Jake's eyes bore into hers, searching, dissecting. He didn't look angry. He didn't even look vengeful. He looked resolute, as if everything had already been decided. Melissa took a shaky step forward. "Jake, what are you doing?" Jake tilted his head slightly, as if amused by the question. "I think you already know." Her gaze flickered to Mark, who let out a weak groan, barely conscious. "You don't have to do this." Jake exhaled slowly, lowering the gun but keeping his grip firm. "That's the thing, Melissa. I do." Melissa's throat tightened. She had always been able to talk her way out of situations, manipulate people into doing what she wanted. But this? She had no leverage here. Jake had all the control. She glanced around, looking for something, anything, that could tip the scales in her favor. But Jake wasn't leaving any openings. He had planned every second of this. "You took everything from me," Jake finally said. "And for a long time I thought the best revenge was to disappear. To let you wonder. But then I realized something." Melissa swallowed. "What?" Jake's lips curled into a humorless smile. "You don't suffer unless you lose something too." Her stomach dropped. "Jake, please?" He raised a hand. "No more lies. No more excuses. Tonight you learn what it means to be powerless." And then, in one swift motion, he lifted the gun and aimed it directly at Mark. A scream tore from Melissa's throat. Jake, stop. The gunshot rang out. But the bullet didn't hit Mark. It slammed into the metal beam just inches away from his head, the deafening sound echoing throughout the warehouse. Mark flinched violently, gasping as if he had just been brought back to life. Melissa's legs nearly gave out. Jake remained unmoved, his expression as cold as steel. "That fear you just felt?" he said calmly. "That's the fear I lived with. Every single day after what you did to me." Melissa's breath came in ragged gasps. "You don't have to do this. We made a mistake." Jake let out a dry laugh. "A mistake?" His gaze darkened. "You didn't trip and fall into an affair, Melissa. You made a choice." She had nothing to say to that, because deep down she knew he was right. Jake took a step closer and for the first time his composure cracked. "You were my wife," he said, his voice raw. "You were supposed to be my partner, my family. And instead you sided with him." Mark groaned weakly, still too out of it to speak. Jake let out a slow breath, his hands tightening around the gun. "You want to know why I brought you here?" he asked. Melissa nodded, afraid to speak. Jake leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Because after tonight you'll never forget what it feels like to lose." Melissa's heart pounded. "Jake, please." But before she could finish, the warehouse doors slammed open. Melissa turned just in time to see a figure rushing in. And suddenly everything changed. Jake's grip tightened around the gun as Robert Henderson stood before him, his father's expression riddled with regret. Melissa's heart pounded as she clutched the chair Mark was tied to, her breath shallow, her pulse erratic. The cold metal of the warehouse walls seemed to close in around them, suffocating, pressing every ounce of tension into the air. "You don't have to do this, Jake," Robert pleaded, taking a cautious step forward. "This isn't who you are." Jake let out a dry, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "You don't know who I am anymore, Dad. And whose fault is that?" Robert exhaled sharply, glancing at Mark, then at Melissa. "I failed you, son. I should have been there for you when they betrayed you. I should have fought for you." Jake's hand trembled slightly, the barrel of the gun dipping lower for just a moment. Melissa saw her opportunity. "Jake," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "please, you were never a killer." Jake's gaze snapped toward her, and for the first time, there was hesitation in his eyes. But then Mark let out a groan, slowly regaining consciousness. His dazed eyes met Jake's, and whatever sympathy Jake had begun to feel vanished. "No," Jake said coldly. "You don't get to walk away from this like nothing happened." He lifted the gun again, his jaw clenched. Robert stepped forward, his voice stronger now. "If you do this, Jake, you'll never be free of them. You'll let them win." Jake's breath hitched and his grip wavered once more. The weight of his father's words hung in the air. Jake's entire body was tense, his mind racing between the past and the present. Revenge had consumed him for so long that the thought of letting it go seemed impossible. But now, as Robert stood before him, offering an out, he felt something shift inside him. Melissa was crying softly, her shoulders trembling. "I regret it, Jake," she whispered. "I regret everything." Jake swallowed the lump in his throat, his thoughts clouded. He had wanted her to suffer, wanted Mark to feel the same helplessness he had once felt. But standing there, gun in hand, he felt tired. He exhaled slowly, the fury that had fueled him flickering. His father placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to forgive them. But don't become what they made you." Jake's vision blurred for a moment. His whole life had been about control, about planning his vengeance. Now, for the first time, he felt like he was the one being given a choice. Finally, his fingers loosened, and the gun dropped to the floor with a metallic clatter. Melissa let out a sob of relief, and Mark slumped in his chair, eyes dazed, barely processing what had just happened. Jake turned to Robert, his expression blank. "What happens now?" Robert squeezed his shoulder. "We move forward." Jake wasn't sure what that meant, but for the first time in a long time, he was willing to try. Mark and Melissa wasted no time untying his restraints. Melissa's hands trembled as she helped Mark to his feet, her eyes flickering toward Jake, searching for any sign of lingering rage. But Jake wasn't looking at them anymore. He was staring past them into the unknown. "You should go," Jake finally said, his voice devoid of emotion. Melissa nodded frantically, supporting Mark as they staggered toward the warehouse doors. Just as they reached the exit, Melissa hesitated and turned back. "Jake." He didn't acknowledge her. He didn't need to. She swallowed hard and disappeared into the night. Robert turned toward his son. You made the right choice. Jake shook his head. I don't know what's right anymore. Robert patted his back. Then let's find out together. As the two men stood there in the flickering warehouse lights, Jake realized something. The revenge he had planned had already been carried out, not in blood but in the way he had made them fear him. And that was enough. For now. Jake stood at the edge of the warehouse lot, watching as the taillights of Mark and Melissa's car disappeared into the night. The anger that had once burned inside him like a raging inferno had dulled, replaced by something emptier. He had won. They would never forget what he had done to them, how close they had come to losing everything. But now what? Robert placed a firm hand on Jake's shoulder. It's time to go home, son. Home. That word felt foreign to him. Where was home now? It wasn't Austin, not anymore. It wasn't this warehouse, this life of vengeance. Where do I even start? Jake asked, his voice almost a whisper. Robert offered him a small, knowing smile. By figuring out who you are beyond the pain. As they drove away from the warehouse, the city lights reflecting off the windshield, Jake stared out at the world he had been hiding from for so long. He had spent so much time being consumed by his past that he had never considered a future beyond it. He had no job, no home, no real connections. But for the first time in a long time he had a chance to rebuild. Austin felt different. The same city he had once called home now felt distant, foreign. As he walked through the streets he could still picture the man he had been. The one who had trusted too easily, who had built a life around people who had betrayed him. His father had taken him in temporarily, offering him a place to stay until he figured things out. Their relationship had been strained for years, but now, after everything, there was a quiet understanding between them. You don't have to rush into anything, Robert had told him one evening over dinner. Take your time. But Jake wasn't sure time was something he had. He was restless. He needed to do something to find purpose beyond revenge. One night he found himself in front of an old friend's bar. Someone who had never betrayed him, never taken advantage of his trust. He stepped inside, inhaling the familiar scent of whiskey and smoke. Jake, a voice called. He turned to see Ryan, his childhood best friend, standing behind the counter. Jake hadn't spoken to Ryan in years. After everything had fallen apart, he had cut ties with almost everyone, not wanting to face their pity or their judgment. But now, as Ryan approached him, he saw something else in his old friend's eyes. Relief. You're back, Ryan said. I never thought I'd see you again. Jake exhaled. Neither did I. Ryan studied him for a moment. So what now? Jake looked around, taking in the familiar surroundings. I don't know. But I think I'm ready to find out. Days turned into weeks. Jake slowly began piecing his life back together, but it wasn't easy. The past clung to him like a shadow. He found work at Ryan's bar, keeping busy, avoiding questions about where he had been and what he had done. He didn't want sympathy. He didn't want to be seen as a victim or a villain. He just wanted to exist without the weight of revenge pressing down on him. One night, as he closed up the bar, he saw a familiar face outside. Melissa. She stood near the curb, her arms crossed over her chest, her expression unreadable. Jake's stomach tightened, but he didn't move. He let her come to him. I heard you were back, she said finally. Jake exhaled, shoving his hands in his pockets. And? Melissa hesitated, then shook her head. I don't know. I guess I just wanted to see for myself. They stood in silence for a long moment. Then she spoke again. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, Jake. I don't expect it. He studied her. For the first time she looked like the one carrying the weight of regret. Then why are you here? She looked away. Because I needed to say it. I needed you to know. Jake nodded slowly. He wasn't sure if forgiveness was something he could give. But maybe, just maybe, letting go wasn't the same as forgetting. Melissa turned to leave, but before she did, she glanced back at him. I hope you find peace. Jake watched as she disappeared down the street. For the first time he thought maybe, just maybe, he would. Jake sat alone in Ryan's bar, staring at the glass of whiskey in front of him. The burn of the alcohol no longer affected him the way it once had. He had spent years numbing himself, running from the pain, but for the first time in a long time, he was facing it head-on. His conversation with Melissa lingered in his mind. Her words had carried sincerity, but did it matter? Could he really find peace? Or was he destined to live with the echoes of his past forever? Ryan leaned against the counter, watching him. You ever think about what's next? Jake scoffed. Next? Ryan nodded. Yeah. You can't just work here forever. I mean, you could, but that's not you. Jake took a slow sip of his drink. I don't know what I am anymore. Ryan sighed. Then maybe it's time to figure it out. Jake looked around the bar, the faint sound of laughter and conversation filling the space. Maybe Ryan was right. Maybe it was time to start thinking about what was next. But where did he even begin? A week later, Jake found himself sitting across from Robert in a quiet cafe. His father had asked to meet him, saying it was important. Robert cleared his throat, sliding a folder across the table. I've been thinking a lot about the future, son. About your future. Jake eyed the folder suspiciously before opening it. Inside were documents, business plans, property listings, financial reports. What is this? Jake asked, frowning. Robert leaned forward. An opportunity. I know you don't want my money, but this isn't about that. I want to invest in you. Help you build something for yourself. Jake hesitated. You don't owe me anything. Robert sighed. I owe you more than you'll ever know. But this isn't about debt. This is about giving you a chance to do something meaningful. Jake closed the folder and exhaled. He had spent so long consumed by revenge that the idea of creating something instead of destroying felt foreign. But wasn't that what he had wanted all along? A fresh start? He met his father's gaze. I'll think about it. Robert nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. That's all I ask. Jake stood on a quiet bridge overlooking the city skyline, the cool night air brushing against his skin. He had spent the last few days thinking about his father's offer, about the idea of moving forward rather than dwelling in the past. For so long he had carried the weight of his betrayal, of his pain. He had let it define him. But now, standing here, he felt something else, possibility. His phone buzzed. A message from Ryan. You coming in tonight? Jake smiled to himself. Not tonight. I have something I need to do. He slipped his phone into his pocket and took a deep breath. He wasn't the man he used to be. He wasn't the man who had vanished, who had sought revenge, who had let his past dictate his every move. He was someone new. And for the first time in years, Jake Henderson was ready to live. 1 year later. The small coffee shop was bustling with activity as Jake stepped inside. The scent of roasted beans filled the air, the sound of laughter and conversation surrounding him. He had never thought he would end up here, owning a small but thriving business, building something from the ground up. But here he was. Ryan waved at him from the counter. Boss, we're running low on espresso beans. Jake smirked. Then order more, genius. Ryan chuckled. You got it? Jake moved through the shop, greeting customers, checking on the staff. He had found something he never thought possible, peace. As he stepped outside for a breath of fresh air, his phone buzzed. A message from his father. Proud of you, son. Jake exhaled, his chest feeling lighter than it had in years. For the first time in a long time, the past didn't haunt him. Because the future? The future was his. Jake's story was one of pain, betrayal, and ultimately redemption. He faced his demons, confronted those who wronged him, and chose to rebuild his life instead of letting the past define him. But what about you? If you were in Jake's position, would you have chosen revenge, or would you have walked away and built something new? Let's discuss. Drop a comment and share your thoughts on Jake's journey. Did he make the right choice? What would you have done differently?